Tonight, we are jumping back into a series I got to start on a Saturday. So if you are totally fixed in your schedule and you go to Wednesdays every single week, you will have all missed part 1. So I'm going to give you a quick little overview. I've been studying through the history of the entire world. This is a study that I sort of resurrected. It's one of the ones I did with my middle schoolers up in youth group, and I've had that request put to me several times by you guys, by other people who come here. Do something like what you do upstairs down here. So this is it. This is my middle school study I did back in 2019, where I take apart all the years of history that the world has been through, 1,000 years at a time, and we just walk through it and we see where God's plan is in that 1,000 years. And so as we do this, we start out in Genesis, heavily using Genesis because there's so many years that are inside of Genesis, and eventually move our way through the whole Bible. And then in the latter studies, we actually leave the Bible into the past, and we start seeing what God did after the last pages of the Bible was written. Okay, so tonight though is only part 2, so we're still in Genesis. Last time in the first 1,000 years, we saw God's plan at work in creation, chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis. In sin, which is strange to think about, but there was part of his plan working even in that in chapter 3, death in chapter 4, and then eternal life in chapter 5. And so we had in that first 1,000 years, but really just in those first 5 chapters, God's glory, our need, and a way for God to redeem us, which is pretty cool to see all of it laid out that quickly in the first 5 chapters. And so we have more stops along the timeline before we get up to present day. And tonight we're going to consider 4 more in this next 1,000-year chunk. So, second 1,000 years, 4 different stops. Tonight we're going to consider the Great Flood, the subsequent Ice Age, the Tower of Babel, and the ensuing dispersion that comes from the Tower of Babel. So, in several places in God's Word, you will find over and over again very careful record keeping. And the record keeping makes almost no sense for anyone to spend that amount of time on unless there just so happened to be an omniscient God behind it, one who knew the value of such data for all the future generations that would read it. And so I think it's preserved because God wanted it preserved. And now we can go back and look at it. We can construct a timeline of over 2,000 years from Adam's creation using just genealogical records in Genesis chapter 5. It's pretty wild. It's the kind of stuff that oftentimes, if you're reading your Bible and you're one of those people like me who, to this day, I'm still all about the narrative. I just want the narrative. That's my favorite part of any book in the Bible. You see a chapter where it's like, so-and-so had a kid, and they had a kid, and they had a kid, and it's tempting to just go right past it, huh? But God has a purpose in these chapters, and it's really amazing when you take that apart and you plug it back into the narrative, what you can get from it. So, this family timeline, it acts as a firm foundation on which we can place all of the events of history. And there's other timelines as well as you go through the rest of the Bible. So we're going to look at our first stop tonight. This is in Genesis chapter 6. We're going to look at the Great Flood, picking up in verse 5. So Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. It says this: "Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord." God experiences great sorrow over sin. It grieves his heart to see the evil, the pain, and the foolishness. God is holy and righteous, and so it is right for him to judge the iniquity in his creation. Noah shows faith in God, though, and so God extends his grace to him. It was certainly possible for others in Noah's day to place their faith in God. Just 14 years before Noah's birth, people could have actually met Seth. So generation 2, Adam and Eve's son, Seth, he was still living just 14 years before Noah. 55 years before that, you could have met Enoch. 57 years before that, you could have met Adam himself. So the lineage of people who knew God clearly was strong, and it was just a little bit removed from Noah. And so Noah grew up in the days where it seems like maybe his dad is one of the only people to really be able to hand down the faith, to hand down the truth about God. And so Noah, he keeps the faith. And you see this family line is not the only one recorded, the only one kept track of because it was the only family line. No, there was plenty of other family lines. This is the only one recorded because it's the only one that leads to the Messiah. It's the only one that leads to the Christ, the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. That's what sets this family line apart. That's what makes this one so important, that it gets chapters devoted to who had who as a son. It's because that's the steps that take you to Jesus Christ. Keep going, though, in the story of the flood. We jump down to verse 13. It says, "And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood, make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and outside with pitch, and this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. You shall make a window for the ark, and you shall finish it to a cubit from above, and set the door of the ark in its side. You shall make it with lower, second, and third decks. And behold, I myself am bringing floodwaters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh, which is in the breath of life, or in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die." Wow. As we saw during creation, though, and in the fall, in death, and even in the promise of eternity, humanity and the earth largely share their fates. God has put mankind over the earth. He has put mankind in charge of the earth. And when God judges the sins of mankind, he so judges the earth. Nature was put in our care at creation, and so it's our responsibility. We're supposed to keep track of it, and God tells us that our sin pollutes it. Not in a chemical sense, not in a ozone depletion sense, but like our sin is actually infecting the world we live in. The curse that came from our sin heavily affected this earth. And so God redeems a remnant of mankind and a remnant of nature. And that's how he's going to start over. Complete reset. Then we jump into chapter 7, skip on down. We have a lot of details there. You're welcome to go back and read, but I'm trying to follow the thread of the plan. Some of the details are going to help us. Some of them are just for that part of the story. They don't contribute as much to the overarching plan that God has in this. So chapter 7, verse 11, it says, "In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened." Skipped a bit there. "And the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And so after decades of building the ark, the flood waters began to both rise from the deep and then fall from the sky." You're surrounded. This may seem like a really small thing to us who have lived our whole lives with storms, some big, some small. I mean, we have storms that might knock down the neighbor's house and leave another house standing. We've seen storms of all kinds, and so it's a little easier for us to hear, oh yeah, it's a big storm, and feel like we understand, feel like we get it. Oh yeah, I've been through storms. But this was like no storm you have ever lived through. This is the greatest catastrophe to ever befall the earth. This event would have reshaped the continents and formed some of them. This was a life-ending event for anyone that was not under God's grace. The term that scientists use to describe the mechanism of the catastrophic plate movement happening during the flood is runaway subduction. Runaway subduction. Enough force is applied at one side of a tectonic plate from superheated water and hot magma. The whole plate moves over at such speed, and there's enough water over top of the plates that one lip slips under the other, and it just keeps going. It's been described as a conveyor belt for continents, where you can quickly shuffle an entire continent down into the magma. It's completely melted and destroyed, leaving behind fresh continent, where all the magma was coming up on the far side of the plate. It also, while it's doing this, has the top edge of some other plate that's scooping off all of the soil and sediment from that continent, mixing it up into the ocean. And this would not only create murky water that would just kill stuff, but it would also raise the sea levels even further because now you're floating a bunch of dirt in with the water. So you've got water coming from below, you've got water coming from above, and you've got the dirt now mixing into the ocean. These soil deposits would not only help the surging oceans go higher, but they would also later in the flood, as the waters start to recede, form new land formations that no one had ever seen before. Ones that weren't part of the original creation. They were there because of the flood. And they would be otherwise impossible. They are only created through this massive surge of water. Jump down to chapter 7, verse 19. And it says, "And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered." So 15 cubits above the mountaintops. "And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man. All in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life, and all that was on the dry land died. So he destroyed all living things which were on the face of the ground, both man and cattle, creeping thing, and bird of the air. They were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive." Now, in this, we see that God's judgment is no joke. This is not a light thing. It's not just a threat. It's justified. And the Bible tells us his judgment, not a flood, but his judgment is coming again on this earth. But his great love, it came first. His mercy and grace, they're here now. And we have to keep those two in context. Yes, his judgment is coming. Don't ever lose sight of that. Don't ever forget that. But his mercy and his grace are here now. When you keep both in mind, they both can make sense. Sometimes if you focus too much on the mercy and the grace, it starts to feel like God will never really defeat evil. God will never really take evil seriously enough to satiate our desire for justice. Likewise, we can go the other way. We can look too much at his justice and say, that's just not fair. That's mean-spirited. Why would he do this to all the people? What if this guy didn't have the same chance as that guy? What if this person didn't get to hear the same gospel message that person got to hear? When you only look at the justice, it can seem unfair. When you only look at the mercy and grace, it can seem unfair. But when you see how perfectly God can hold both in his hands, then you start to see how perfect God is and how it is fair in an ultimate, in a final way. And that's what we see in the story with Noah, that he desires that all would be saved, but only Noah could be. No one else had the faith required. If no one has their faith in God and God goes to them and says, hey, I'm going to destroy everything in a flood, but build me a giant boat and I'll save you with it. Without faith, they're just going to say, no, I don't want to. That sounds crazy. That's ludicrous. But we read in 1 Timothy 2, "Therefore, I exhort first of all that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings and all who are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and reverence. For this is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all men to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth." This is the heart of God. Paul writes this to Timothy, so it's from a traveling missionary to a pastor, and he just says, this is the heart of God. He desires that all would be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. And it was true back then. It was true in Noah's day. This hasn't changed. This isn't something God picked up when Jesus came to the earth. This was always in the heart of God. And so then the next question might be, if you accept that, if you take that, if you absorb that truth, then you might ask, well, why hasn't he judged yet? Why hasn't he put his foot down? Why hasn't he put a stop to the evil? And the truth is, he's not lazy. He's not waiting without reason, but he is waiting. He's waiting for the evils of mankind to become ripe. That's the way he talks about it. It was funny, we were out on Father's Day walking around, and my brother-in-law picked a piece of fruit off a tree and bit into it. He's like, oh, it's so good. And he grabbed another one and he gave it to my wife, and she was hesitant because it didn't look ripe. It just didn't look ripe. And he said, oh, it's so good. Turns out he's been on a sugar fast for like 2 weeks. And that thing was the sweetest thing he tasted in 2 straight weeks. So she bites into it, hesitant, not sure, and goes, yeah, that's not ripe. There's no way. Hard as a rock, no sweetness to it, all pucker power. It has to do with the way you look at things. It has to do with the way you're conditioned. God knows what evilness is, but he's seen the future and he knows how bad it will be. And so when he looks at the evil around us, he knows exactly how bad it is, but he also knows it's not as bad as it will be. It's not as bad as it's gonna get. He knows what ripeness looks like. And so he knows when the right time for justice is. And his timing is perfect. Okay, then we get towards the end of the flood, chapter 8, jump on down to verse 13. And again, we're skipping some details. They're very important to Noah's story, not necessarily to the overall story of this 1,000-year chunk. So chapter 8, verses 13 and 14, they say this, "And it came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, that the waters were dried up from the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and indeed the surface of the ground was dry." So it was dry right around where he could look. "And in the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dried." So that's God's authorial intent. He saw it as dry, but later, about 2 months later, the whole earth was dry. And so that means that this flood took over a full year to come to completion. But the mark that it left on the earth is still around to this day. The layers of soil, which later become rock, now they're rock to us, those were laid down during the flood, and they have striking features, and they do not appear to match any telling of a constant, slow deposition over long periods of time. They bear the hallmarks of a catastrophic flood, and it's not just one layer, it's not just two layers, it's every layer all the way up, nearly to the top. Scientists can't even discern what the current soil deposition rate is. Not on average, not across the globe. You can do it for any one segment, but it seems like the soil's just moving around. And there isn't actually a growing amount of soil if you average out the entire planet, which makes you wonder how you ever, no matter how many billions of years you have to wait, got layers that stack up the height of the Grand Canyon. If there isn't an actual accrual across the entire planet, how could you get layers over time? So what we do often see if you look at the layers is a few different things that say this was from a flood. One of them is that many rock layers were laid down so rapidly, and then before they lithified, they were disturbed. And they were able to be rumpled and bent and spun into funny shapes. And some of them actually went through an earthquake, and the shapes are completely random. They look like oscillations that would form if you just shook paint in a can. And then they were buried. And the pressure laid it down and started to flatten it out, and they started to lithify. Lithification is just when you have that sediment that's containing moisture get pressurized to the point where the moisture has to go, and suddenly you get rock. We also see many, many examples of fossils that were formed in multiple layers. So the actual subject that was fossilized was buried in several layers of sediment, and as all of those layers lithified, the fossil fossilized. Well, the plant, the animal fossilized. Even though each layer that it's fossilized in supposedly took millions of years to form. So you have one fossil going through several that are all millions of years old, except things would normally decay in that span of time, actually in a much shorter span of time. Many of the fish that we find fossils of would normally decay inside of a week if they didn't get fossilized. So if we know anything about decomposition and the formation of fossils, then we know that both facts can't be true at the same time. You can't have millions of year-old layers, multiple of which are bearing one thing that can and does decompose. They have to all be laid down simultaneously, or at least in rapid succession, and then they can be fossilized. So from left to right up here, we should be seeing, yep, there we go. So on this side, we've got a dinosaur footprint that was laid down in soft floodwater saturated ground. And so it actually deformed the layer on top and the layer underneath and the layer underneath and the layer underneath, forming a downward cone even where the foot of the dinosaur didn't touch. Almost like he was walking on a sheet. So he pressed through the earth and it formed a giant cone leading to the footprint, which was then covered over immediately by more sediment, so much so that when the whole thing lithified, the sediment on top was actually a stronger material, just happened to be stronger. And so now as the material underneath falls out, you can walk under it and you can look up at the relief of a dinosaur footprint. Okay, so that would mean that all the layers he walked on were all liquid at the same time. They weren't laid down over millions of years because they would be rock by then and water retouching them wouldn't make a difference. It would still be a rock. So that he presses it down, and then the layer on top is quickly put on after. And there's a whole trail of those footprints. That's just one of them. He left an entire trail. They all did this. And it's right along a mountainside path. You can crawl under them. They got little signs. They tell you what it is. It's kind of cool. Okay, the one next to that, that is a sample of one of the thousands of nautiloid fossils in the same layer of rock. If you go to the Grand Canyon, this one layer has, I think they said, one nautiloid for every 4 square meters. So for like the whole stretch of the Grand Canyon, in this particular layer of soil, there's a nautiloid every 4 meters. And not the ones they're finding are prehistoric, so like prehistoric. So they're this long. It's a nautiloid shell that's this long, as big as your forearm. But the weird thing is this, 17% of them fossilized in a perfectly vertical direction, and the rest are all in these scattered formations of horizontal. But you can't fossilize something as big as your arm standing up if each layer it's fossilized in represents thousands of years. I think the typical number for most layers of soil, somewhere around a centimeter every 10,000 years, something like that. So if it's as long as your arm, that means there's 10,000 years, there's 10,000 years, there's 10,000 years, there's 10,000 years, there's 10,000 years. The whole thing would have to survive for millions of years for it to just get fossilized, but you look at it and there's no deterioration on the upper portion. It's exactly the same level of deterioration all the way down the fossil. Then you've got after that, let's see, which number 3? Number 3 is a tree. We find lots of these. Trees are often taller than the layer they are found in. It's pretty common. And trees have this funny thing where they like to float not always sideways. Depending on how much the tree is all intact, it will float vertically. That's because there's heavier minerals at the bottom of a tree. It's not true of every tree, but a lot of trees will do it. And so if they're being smooshed along in a mudslide, and then at some point they come to rest, they will actually right themselves in the mud, but they then got buried by another layer and another layer until the whole tree was encased. So again, if this formed over millions and millions of years, the top should be gone, not all the same exact level of fossilization, the same exact level of deterioration. It's all identical all the way up and down the tree. The one in the picture actually has a root intact in a whole nother layer. It has one root down in a further layer. It's just wild. The last one on this list is an entire school of fish. Now, I did turn the picture sideways just because it fit on the screen better. So it's actually a horizontal school of fish. But that whole school of fish is actually in the rock in 3 dimensions. It's not a flat plane of fish. They were not like slammed down by a wave and put into a paper of fish. They're in 3 dimensions, and they have the other dimensions that they sliced away to get you that good view. And they actually mapped out the positions of the fish. They are in perfect school formation. We actually have figured out the math on how fish swim in schools, and they match. They're a dead ringer for how fish swim in schools. So they were trapped in sediment mid-swim. That is not a millions of years process. You can't do that. That doesn't work. So someone could say, they could come along and they could try and, provide falsification. That's what you do with the scientific method. They could say, well, this is a popular spot for that species of fish. Each fish is a different event. 1 fish buried, 2 fish buried, 3 fish buried. But then the arrangement of the fish should be random, right? You would expect a pile of bones. You wouldn't expect a school of fish. You only get a school of fish if the whole sediment gets pressurized at once. They're trying to swim through muddy water and suddenly something falls on top. Bam! Locked in place. That's what this represents. So, all of this put together, fossils do not help them in this regard. This really fits flood geology. And so we move on. The geologic column does not appear anywhere on the earth like it does in the detailed diagrams that we see in textbooks. And in many places, the layers are completely out of order, without any reasonable evidence that they at some point flipped post-deposition. And so we actually do find that on many parts of the planet, whole layers are missing. In fact, most of the planet is missing most of the layers. The only place you will ever find all the layers, top to bottom, perfect order, is in a textbook. There isn't even one place. The only 3 places on the entire planet that have 10 of the 10 or 11 layers don't even have them in completion, meaning the layer is subcomplete. There are sublayers within layers, and they're not all there. So there isn't one place on the entire planet where the whole geologic column is represented, which means if every layer represents a time span, many parts of the planet didn't exist and then started to exist again. or many parts of the planet did not experience any of the normal sediment building processes for huge swaths of time, and then they started doing it again. That doesn't make any sense. We don't have any mechanisms that would explain that. The only thing that would explain that is the randomness of water pushing sediment around. That these sediments actually came from different ecosystems. And the ecosystems are well represented in the fossil record. However, evolution is not. Fossils' burial locations tend to line up with God's account of the rising, surging oceans that sweep across the land, and they do it spectacularly. They capture an ecosystem almost precisely, but they don't seem to capture spans of time very well. And so we have some for instances of this. One of them is vertebrates. According to the evolutionary tree of life and the direction that evolution flows, vertebrates will not be found in the lower layers. That is what scientists would assume. And when we had very few fossils, it did actually seem to be the case. But we kept digging. And so vertebrates turned out, although they were originally thought to be somewhere in like the middle Ordovician period, Wikipedia still says they're all the way up in the Denovian, even though that's been known to be false since 1988. We found them in the lower Ordovician period. And then lately, we kept digging. We actually found them all the way in the lower Cambrian, amongst the earliest animal fossils that exist. So literally, vertebrates that are supposedly up the tree of life have now been found at the complete bottom, right alongside all of the invertebrates. And so we basically have no reason to assume that invertebrates and vertebrates arose at different times at all. We have direct evidence saying they arose at the exact same time, which really leaves evolutionists going, well, when did they evolve then? And what did they evolve from? Because supposedly invertebrates gave rise to vertebrates. Keep going though, there's more examples. It turns out that birds lived long before their dino ancestors, which is a bit of a problem. Evidence of mammals is also buried way too deep for their supposed evolution to have ever taken place. Flowering plants, they supposedly came long after the fern-like cousins that we have. But now that's up for dispute as well because we discovered pollen in the pre-Cambrian strata. So before we find any life forms that are, large and macro and you can even tell what it is, we find pollen. That tells me contamination happened, but not contamination now. Contamination all the way back at the formation of the fossils. That pollen existed, it was plentiful, and it fell into the ocean where it did nothing, and it just sunk to the bottom, and it was there with all of the single-cell organisms. It was there with all of the plankton, and the fossils form, and now you have fossil pollen and fossil plankton. All of the earliest tiny single-cell organisms right along with the pollen from the land. Now, normally a creature wouldn't get buried at that level because they're not there. They don't live there. So when you bury them up with soil, you're not going to capture anything in that soil. But as you keep going, you see more and more ecosystems getting taken over by the flood. And so that's what the chart actually shows. If you look at the real deposition layers that you find things in, it shows you the ecosystem that the animal lived in. Also, though, it can show you creatures trying to escape. And so oftentimes that's what you find with something like horse hoof prints, is not the creature itself, but actually a large, fast-moving creature that's tall enough to hold its head out of the water. You just find evidence of it leaving. That's all you find. And then later, higher up, as they ran out of land to go to, then you start to find their remains. Then you start to find the whole creature buried. So it really tracks well with the flood story. And so again, without a prior bias, most students of both the geologic and fossil records would find they're best explained by being caused by one great flood. And there's just no time for everything to evolve when the fossil record keeps giving earlier and earlier dates for things and broken backwards timelines. So God is real. He is the creator. We learned that last time. Ignoring this, though, is convenient. It's downright easy if you have a handy origin story that you can lean on. You can just forget God. You can push him out of things. But the logic for an evolutionary origin is circular. The dates of the fossils rely on the strata they're found in. The dates of the strata rely on the fossils you find in them. It doesn't actually lead you to an age for anything. So we can plainly see the fossil record just gives you whole ecosystems in a chunk. buried in these massive tectonic and floodwater movements. And we also see countless examples of that evidence of the creatures fleeing, which tells you something about the circumstance in which everything was buried. Okay, keep going. The floodwaters, they're finished. The earth is reshaped. There would have been one more mighty consequence. Genesis 7:11 says the deep fountains burst forth and they started the flood. And we know that the earth's depths are actually very, very hot. And when those hot fountains burst, the global waters would warm. The whole temperature would go up. And that's exactly what's needed for increased rain and snowfall. And we also know that continued volcanic eruptions from the deep fountains would have ejected a supply of airborne aerosols that lingered long after the flood. And as time passed, Earth would gradually start to settle into the new norm after all those devastating effects. But you would have this ice age forming from the reflection of sunlight from all those aerosols and this increased rain and snowfall. And so you would have this leftover evidence, if this was true, of glacial activity in northern areas immediately following the evidence for the flood. So that's what you would expect to find. Lo and behold, it's exactly what we find. We go and we look, and right above the flood layers is where all the glacial activity occurs. And so the timeline matches perfectly with the model. In fact, that model of how you get an ice age only works with a global flood predating it. There's been a lot of other models people have tried, and every time we run the simulation, it fails. We have not been able to come up with another plausible reason for an ice age to occur on the planet. You could get close, but you could never sustain it for long without something like a global flood caused by tectonic and volcanic activity. But you throw that in the mix, immediately it all works, the simulations check out, everything just flows from it. And so that's what we would expect to see, and it also makes sense of the next part of the story. So we jump back in. After the flood, God gives Noah and his sons this command. This is critical to the next few chapters. So Genesis chapter 9, verse 1. So God blessed Noah and his sons, and he said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. That's a blessing and a command because he's saying you can do it. I'm telling you to go be multiplying, to be fruitful, to fill the earth. So it's a blessing because he's saying, I know you can do this. That's why he asked them to do it. But it's also a command. You're supposed to do this. He wanted the earth to be the responsibility of humans, and you can't do that with 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. You need a lot of humans to properly subdue the earth, to take care of the earth. And so that's what they were supposed to do. And this is it's a new earth in a very real sense. I mean, everything is starting over. The seeds are replanting themselves. The animals are spreading out from the ark. But God's plan is still leading to Jesus. The same as it was before the flood, the same as it is after the flood. And so he reinstates one of his original mandates. That's where this leads. Spreading out, making nations, subduing the earth, it leads to Jesus. The earth was meant to be covered by people. Nations of people working together all to the glory of God. That's the plan. But 3 generations after the flood, we read in chapter 11, it's still not happening. They're still not doing it. There isn't that much of the earth that they've subdued. They're all in one place. So turn with me to Genesis chapter 11. The first 9 verses go like this. Now the whole earth had one language and one speech, and it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Then they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They had brick for stone and they had asphalt for mortar, and they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. Gee, wouldn't that be unfortunate if you actually did what God told you to do? Keep going though, 5 through 9 say this. But the Lord came down to the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language. And this is what they begin to do. Now, nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore, its name is called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. They lacked faith in God. They lacked respect for him and his mandate. And it's sad to think, Noah, if you check the timeline, he would be alive to see this day. The day his ancestors' mistakes were in some way repeated by his descendants. This event is an important one in human history, though, because it answers so many questions that anthropologists like to make up answers for. Questions about language, the spread of humanity across the globe. It predicts what we find in both women's mitochondrial DNA and men's Y chromosomal DNA. And with some aid from the Ice Age, it also answers the question of how animal and human populations traversed the globe. How was that possible? If everything started in one point, how did they get back to the far-flung corners of Australia? How did that happen? So if you use the records in chapter 10, you can even see the directions that many of our ancestors moved at this point. Because Moses is the one writing this, he's basically updating you on the dispersal of humans from Noah to Moses' point in history. So if you want past Moses, you got to go to another source. But Moses gives us kind of where everybody starts to go. And so we've got like some best guesses, but you can see here there's a lot more land bridges. The white lines are essentially where the borders and boundaries are today. And if you just lowered the ocean, if nothing else changed, but you just lowered the ocean to an ice age level, there'd be a whole lot of land bridges opening up. You could get to Australia, no problem. That'd be just a hop, skip, and a jump. And you can get over to America from the top of Asia. Not hard at all. And so you just see things being able to go in these different directions. Also, because everything's regrowing from obliteration, the longer you travel, the better things will look. Does that make sense? The longer you travel, the better things will look, because the longer you wait to settle, the longer nature will have had to make that place look like pre-flood conditions. So each time someone decides, I'm just going to push on a little further, they're rewarded. They're rewarded every time they do it. Oh, this looks a little better. This looks a little better. But it really does pressure humanity to travel out horizontally, because the caps would be way colder. It also means that in the desert regions like around Israel, it wouldn't be a desert yet. You would have started back with tropical conditions, and it would have worked its way towards the desert today. So a lot of questions get answered when you just start to put these things in their proper timeline. It's marvelous, though, to me, that God didn't just choose to wipe them out. You see the heart of God, you see the plan of God, you see how carefully he's guarding his plan. He wants to bring us to Jesus, and then everyone starts to follow evil. And he's down to one guy left, and he says, all right, that's it, we're resetting everything. And then you get to Babel. It feels like almost a repeat. It feels like the whole world's trying to get in the way of his plan again. He said, spread out, make nations, subdue the earth. And they decide not to. But the grace of God is that he doesn't choose judgment. He chooses discipline. And this shows us the Father's heart. He didn't just pull Noah out and say, all right, we're starting over one more time. You're going to live for a few hundred more years, so you'll make it. No. Instead, he decides to discipline his kids. Proverbs tells us, chapter 3, verse 12, for whom the Lord loves, he corrects, just as a father, the son in whom he delights. So he corrects them. I always read this story as a kid. I think I even saw cartoons of the Tower of Babel where after God comes down, he knocks over the tower. He kicks it over and he starts scaring everyone out of Babel. But that's not the story. If you reread it verse by verse, line by line, what does it say? He says, he confuses their speech and they decide, well, I guess we should go. They decide, let's not finish this. So the discipline worked. That's the heart of a father. That's the heart of the Father. You don't take out the big guns when they're not necessary. You start small. You start with correction. And we ultimately deserve judgment. That's why I say it's beautiful. That's why it's God's mercy. Because any sin is worthy of judgment. But he loves us. And so he makes a way. Noah wasn't sinless. Don't get the wrong idea about his story either. But he walked with God. And he acted on his faith in God. And so God made a way for Noah. That's God's heart. Noah's family line eventually leads to Jesus, the Son of God, God in human form. And all of human history pivots on Jesus. He is the point. He is the reason for all of this. He is how God makes a way for all of us. And we've seen both in our first study last time and then tonight as well, that sin brings death. We saw it with Adam and Eve. We saw it with Cain and Abel. Now we see it here with the flood. Sin brings death. But through his willing death on the cross, Jesus did something amazing. He was killed by his own people, and so he paid the price of sin without ever sinning. That's what's so amazing. He paid a price that we owed. Anybody else who could say it, just spout the words, "Oh, I'll die in your place." They could say it, but there's a problem there. They have their own sin to contend with. They couldn't die in anyone's place. They can only die in their own. But Jesus, he is the exception. And so he's taken on himself what we deserved, and so his sacrifice can count for you and make you righteous. It's the same way that God justifies Noah. It's through faith. That's what turns the key. That's what makes it work. And so I'm asking all of you, whether you don't know the Lord tonight or you do, whether you're not following or you've been following him for years, would you treat the Lord God with the honor due to his name? And would you live a life of faith and live it for his glory? That's what I see in the example of Noah. Not a perfect man, but a man who treated God with the honor and respect that was due him, and he lived his life as a life of faith.